everybody, welcome back to the next chapter in our story. Have you remembered to hit that bell so that you're getting the notifications when I put up my new videos? So you'll remember last episode was the passing of my mum in December 1971, and I said that we'd be looking at the aftermath or aftermath. These videos will be bilingual, by the way. So yeah, what happened in the time afterwards? How do we adjust and how do we adapt? Well, firstly, we left that big house in Prince George Avenue, 589 Prince George Avenue, and we moved to the Park Hotel. Now, that was convenient for Dad because, well, he could go back to work. He was working shift work, night shift, day shift, and there was a dining room. The hotel was on a corner. It's now accommodation, I think. It was on a corner. It was a sort of red brick building. It had a bar down the bottom, and it had a lounge, and then the dining room to the side. So, there were often times I would traipse down on my own to sit at a table and have my dinner. They all knew me, and Dad would be at work, and Aidan started verging out a bit on his own. He got heavily into the bands and his music and his friends, and so he started becoming more and more independent. I was able to buy one of my first pets of my own. Was a little white rat, actually not that little, called Joey. White rat with the pink eyes, and very affectionate, very intelligent. Aidan also wanted one, so we went back to the pet shop. We got another. Dad said, make sure that you get, they're both males. Well, of course, Aidan ended up with a female, so we had a rat problem for a little while, but I managed to keep my white rat Joey in that Park Hotel room. Now, for Dad, it must have been one of the hardest challenges of his life. He always said that he wasn't really suited to being a single parent, and it would have been better had Mum survived and he'd gone. So he found religion for a while. He converted across to the Catholic faith. Mum was a Catholic. I've spent the last 52 years or so thinking about grief and grieving for Mum, and I might have made out last episode that we just got up and we carried on with life, and she was kind of forgotten. There was no public displays of grief on my part. But the grieving was done inside, but I'm also left with the inevitable fact that in some ways it was probably better that Mum did go at that stage, purely for my sake, because I suppose there would have been a messy divorce and separation. I would have gone back to Australia. Mum would have tried to have brought us up on her own, I suppose. Maybe I would have seen Dad every now and then, maybe not. In some ways, as harsh as it sounds, Mum going when she did made things a lot easier for us three. So let's get that out of the way. Now, as I said, Dad, for a while he converted to Catholicism. I've got a photo here. This is, I think it might be a Holy Communion. First Holy Communion, maybe. I can't remember what Catholics did, but I know for a while Dad was giving their lessons in catechism, which is a Catholic sort of like a Sunday school, but I think it tends to be on a Friday. After hours, Dad would come and give some of the lessons in the class. Number one class, I started a fist fight. My dad was the teacher. It didn't go down well. But we made friends with other Catholics in the church and the congregation, and one of those was actually some kids that approached me at school to tell me that they were living in 589 Prince George Avenue, and they were the Crystals. There were two boys, Peter and Chris or Kenny. There was a bunch of them. They were a typical Catholic family, a bunch of kids. So they'd moved in after we moved out, so I actually started going back to that house again. and we still remember. We went back to school in 1972. Up until then, I'd been befriending the Jewish kids in school. No particular reason, although they seemed to be the outsiders in the classrooms, and me being an English speaker, Australian, and slow to adapt to, Afrikaans and all that, as I've spoken about. I tended to drift towards these Jewish kids. And one of them was called Simon Gross, and we were typical kids of 11 or 12. We flew kites, we rode our bicycles, we made stilts, we collected stamps, we had little secret clubs where sometimes spin the bottle. With Simon's sister would sit in the room, we'd spin the bottle and things like that. Very innocent. One of the other kids that I became friendly with was a guy called Hillel Escher, also a Jewish kid. Now he was chubby. No way to say it, but he was chubby, he had quite big cheeks, and he had this little cowlick curl with the fringe on his head. One of the things I remember about Hillel was someone at school, and this is dreadful. I don't know how poor Hillel survived physically or mentally, but someone would get behind Hillel and knock him over, and then the call would go around the schoolyard, "Stacks on the middle, stacks on the middle." And all these kids would come from all directions and they'd be piling on top of Hillel. And the poor kid would be yelling out, "Get off me, get off me." He was the other friend that I made. But they were very, and the Crystal Boys, as I said, they were very staid, traditional kids that were from balanced, well-adjusted families and homes. Something changed in that 1972, and it wasn't a decision, or wasn't a mental decision on my part, but something changed in me, and I found myself becoming rebellious and hating the system, bucking the system. Now, I said Aidan was starting to kind of move on a bit and make some other friends and get his musical interests going. And one of those kids that he became friendly with was a kid called Reggie Herold. Reggie Herold had also a string of brothers. So let's say Reggie was about 17, Colin was 16, say Gary was about 15, and my one was Arnie, or Arnie, who was about 12, 13 I suppose. And then below him he had a young brother called Dennis, who was about 10 or maybe 9. And then they had a younger sister who was about 7. The last of them was a girl, Vivian. And my brother said, "You ought to get to know these kids, the Heralds," and maybe he put them up to it because they approached me. I wasn't really good at introducing myself to strangers, so they approached me and they said, "You've got to come home with us, come and see where we live," something along that. And I'll never forget that first bus ride. So I must have told Dad, "Look, I probably won't be home tonight. I'm going to stay at these kids, the Heralds. They live out in a place called the State Mines." So we finished school, and they knew the routine. They did it every day. So we went across to the school bus. They seemed to have seats reserved at the back of the bus, and they sat down, and I was with them, of course. We were at Brenthurst Primary. We had the sort of like a maroon purple blazer, woolen blazer, and off the bus rumbled away from the primary school. The first stop was Brackpan High. A whole lot of other kids got on with their candy stripe blazers, English speaking. We then rumbled through streets in the top end of Brackpan, stopping frequently for kids to get off, until we pulled in outside the Afrikaans primary school, and a whole swag of kids poured onto it. They were primarily in grey and green, and then there was the chatter of Afrikaans, and there was we were at the back, and on we rolled again. Some of those Afrikaans kids got off until we got to the Afrikaans high school, and another wave of kids came on. These ones had had the blazers on. They were the high school kids. There was pushing and shoving with English-speaking kids from Brackpan High, and there was yelling and things, chips and that being thrown across aisles, and the driver was telling everyone to shut up and sit down. And I suppose you might be asking, if you don't know, well, where were the African kids? Where were the black kids going to school? Well, they went to the location. They had these drafty brick block houses in the location that had no windows, just bars on the windows, no air conditioning, just a fan if they were lucky, I suppose. And they used chalkboards and 50 or 60 kids to a classroom. Probably no shoes, very little in the way of uniform. So they had nothing like we did as far as educational standards. Anyway, on the bus rolled. It took about an hour. I'd say it was about 15 kilometres from school to where the Heralds lived. On we rumbled through back streets and places I didn't even know existed in Brackpan. And kids kept getting off from being cramped and jammed like this. Gradually we were pretty much the only kids on the bus until we rumbled into State Mines, which was way out on the outside of Brackpan. And the Heralds were the last kids on the bus. And so off we trooped, and the bus turned and finished its route and made its way back. And I followed the Herald kids to where they were living. Their mum, they were from a single parent situation. Their mum worked at the State Mines golf course and left everything to a maid to look after this tribe of kids, because she was rarely there. She was working to try and put food on the table for them. So the kids would dump all their school bags on the front stoop, and they would go in, and straight away they'd be yelling at the maid, Polly or something. Hey, Polly, where's our tea? Bring the tea, Polly. Ach man, hungry, bring the tea. So Polly would come out with this big pot of tea. I never drank tea as a child, but they did. They had the tin mugs, very milky with a lot of sugar, and she poured it out. She also bought a whole block of bread with some spread and some jam, and she cut these big thick wedges of bread for them, put the butter on and the jam, and there were the Herald kids drinking their mugs of tea and eating these wedges of bread until that was all finished. And then they said, well let's go out now. I suppose we were home by about 2:30 maybe. So there seemed to be plenty of time left in the day for having fun. So on that first day, they took me across to the tip. The State Mines had a big tip. You had to drive around to get up to the top of it. But for those kids, they had paths and tracks that were going through the bush, making their way up to the top of the tip. Now some of the older kids, Colin and Gary, they grabbed axes and saws. I had no idea what we were up to. We passed this dam on the way. This was the water that was pumped up from the mine. State Mines was, or had been until recent, a functioning gold mine. There was a lot of abandoned buildings and run-down facilities. The people that lived out there probably would have been the mine employees, but the mine had shut down because it was no longer viable. So all the infrastructure was there, but it was all broken and run down now. The swimming pool had planks that the Heralds had put down into the pool to ride their bikes around there. So this lake was yellow from the tailings of this dam, whatever they dredged out of it. The lake was yellow. It would leave your clothes yellow. We passed that, and there were lots of reeds growing along the side of the lake, and we made our way up the top of the tip where these cars were rolled over and pushed over, and they selected a car for me, and they started hacking with the axe the struts of the car roof. And until they eventually had this removed from the car. It might have been a VW Bug or something, and one of them had like a sledgehammer sort of thing, and they started banging the sides of this roof up until they were satisfied with it, and they just merely pushed it down the side of the tip, towards the lake, and off we set. So now some of those other kids had left us and gone ahead into the reeds, and they emerged out onto the lake. They had long poles made out of bamboo, and they were standing on these car roofs like gondolas from Venice, punting around the river. And sure enough, they gave me my roof, and I found myself a stick or a reed, and I was able likewise to stand up. Now one of them had like a combi roof that could, half a dozen kids could sit in there. You've got to remember that although Arnold was my friend, and he was the one I hung around, each of the other brothers had their own friends, and that's where I met Brian Gould. He was friends with Gary, who was a grade above Arnold and myself. So there were lots of kids there, and thus began the season of the heralds, I suppose. I don't know how long it lasted for, but often I'd get there, I'd get the bus with them, and I'd just get up in the morning, grab my shoes and whatever I needed, my school bag, and get on the bus with them, go back to to school, and then at the end of repeat process. I was spending days on end until I probably ran out of money or needed to go home for something or another, and that's when Dad would see me. Sometimes I'd make excuses and I couldn't find the bus would arrive. It only came once a day to take me back home again, and I'd be rushing around looking for my shoes or something or another, and I'd miss the bus until we got confident we could start walking. You could walk there as well, and that was fascinating. The Heralds knew the tracks to go down. There was an abandoned set of old rail lines, and at one stage they'd found one of these trolleys that would work along the train line. There was abandoned swimming holes. There were mine shafts we would go down with torches. We'd go down, climb down a mine shaft till you just saw this tiny, little spot of light at the end. We'd had torches. There was aviaries for bees, those boxes. The heralds would put on hats covered with netting and socks on their hands, and they'd go and lift up the trays of honey, steel honey. There was houses that sometimes, I remember, we put on, the kids would put on a long overcoat, and one would sit on the shoulders of the other kid, and he'd wear this long overcoat buttoned up with a hat on, and he'd be walking along and knocking on doors, or sometimes we'd steal the people would leave their milk bottles out with little, they call them tickies, little coupons or coins for milk, and we'd steal those. There was a thing called the ticky box, which was where you put coins in to make phone calls, and the heralds would swing on the door of the booth and kick this thing. If they got it at the right angle, it'd start spitting out coins like a one-armed bandit. I suppose you're getting the impression that we were vandals and hooligans, and there's a degree of truth to that. But at the time, it just seemed like a hell of a lot of fun. There was what they called a foofy slide, which was climbing up a tree. It seemed so high at the time, and they'd put cable across between two trees, and they had a piece of pipe, a cut piece of pipe that you held, and you, like a flying fox, they would call it. Riding bikes around these salt pans, these flats. We'd be on bikes, and we'd have reeds that we'd pulled up and sharpen. As you rode past on your bike, you'd be throwing like jousting. So you could walk as well. It would take about an hour to walk from the state mine to where I was living, which was on the other side of the dam, a place, Gladstone Avenue, which was, so it was the right side. It took about an hour. You went through bush tracks. There were like weeds and growth and thorn trees that were, shoulder high. The Africans would have made these tracks, and every now and then it would all burn down, and it would all be black stubble along the ground. Water holes you'd pass where you might jump in and have a swim, walk along the train tracks. Part of the dam was it was a sewerage plant that had big tubs of water that were being treated for sewerage, and we knew it was always being patrolled. There were like guards walking along the perimeter of the fence line. There's quite a big fence around the sewerage plant, and don't know why, but Brian and I on one occasion decided to jump the fence and climb the fence and jump into this sewerage plant, just purely to get chased. And sure enough, the guard saw us and he came running out, and we scaled the fence and we jumped into the lake and swum away, and he was just shaking his head. One other memory I have is the dam had this little island in the middle of the lake, and there were trees on there and birds nesting and that sort of thing. The Heralds and I and Brian, we bought this inflatable dinghy. It was late afternoon when we rowed across to this lake, to the island. Real adventurers. I mean, we climbed off onto the island, and maybe we made a little fire and heated some baked beans or something, and then it was time to go back. And by now it was getting late, and the dam was a lot choppier than it had been. The wind had come up, and I think we had like the lids of cake tins that we were using as oars. So sure enough, we had to overload the dinghy to get back. We could no longer afford to take a couple of trips, and we started taking water on, and we were funneling out the water as quick as we could, and yet we were still going down, and eventually it was an abandoned ship, and we swam back to the shoreline. And the amount of times I would come home with my school clothes covered in that yellow staining from the dam at State Mines, or my shoes wet, or my blazer all wet from these adventures with these kids. So that's how I got on initially in those years after Mum went, was from these kids, the Heralds, and that playground out where they lived. It was it's difficult to put it into words. I do have one item left, and I'll go and get that for you. So this is actually from the State Mines, from the days I'm describing. Danger, Chavar, Afrikaans, and Ngozi would be the Zulu or African language. It's probably from a power station or something. I've had that all those years. There was one time, and one of these abandoned mining buildings had on the rooftop, it was about that high. There was a brick wall around the rooftop, and we flooded it with water so you could float on top of this brick house, like a little swimming pool. There was another occasion when we went into one of these abandoned, it was like a pump house, and we were mucking around fiddling with things, and I found this tap with a hose on it, and I was trying to loosen it to see what would happen when excuse me, bang, all this water started shooting up and hitting the ceiling of this. It was corrugated iron, this pump house, and the water was flying up there, and the Heralds found a bit of broken stick, and we hammered it in there, and tried to stop this water of flooding the whole place. So those are some of the memories of State Mines. I'm sure there's plenty of others that I've forgotten. That was, Dad gave me the freedom, gave me the independence, and trusted that, I wasn't going to be getting into too much trouble. I did get into some trouble, because towards the end of the time at State Mines, we used to go in on a Saturday morning, a group of us kids, and we'd just walk up and down the shops, and like young teenagers do, they tend to look for trouble around shopping centres. I started shoplifting, and for a while got away with it. I was shoplifting ridiculous things, balloons and little dinky cars, and all sorts of rubbish, streamers. And eventually I was caught and held by the newsagents, and poor old Dad was called down to the police station. I was fingerprinted. I'm not sure if I got caned, but it was certainly embarrassing, and it put an end to my shoplifting endeavours. We were at the we were still at the Park Hotel by that stage, but we would be moving. It started getting a bit cramped, and the 2nd December, after Mum had gone, my sister came over again just to see how we were going and spend Christmas with us again. And we took her to Swaziland. I think her and I went down to Durban in Dad's car. So we'll leave it there. That takes in the whole 1 year of after Mum had passed. It gives you an idea of, I suppose, how each of us handled the grief. I threw myself into the adventures out of state mines. Aidan was getting into his music. Dad was concentrating on work. But he had started to discover Swaziland as well, and getting in his car and heading off for weekends to Swaziland. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for sticking with me. And stay tuned for the next episode, which is where we went after the Park Hotel. Over and out.